A very warm welcome once again, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and welcome back to those of you who are regular listeners. And if you've just found our podcast, it's great to have you on board. And hopefully some of the subjects that we discuss through this series of podcasts, which have now been going pretty much for their first year, hopefully will enlighten you into marine matters. And particularly those of you who are studying may find a lot of these podcasts very helpful in getting a better understanding of maritime matters in general. Before we commence with the podcast, I just want to highlight the fact that we have recently launched a new app. It's a quiz app and designed to help you study. The quiz app itself, currently launched, is a COLREGs quiz app with multiple ways of testing and teaching you the collision regulations, all the way from flip cards to buoys that flash, to actions that you need to take, to scenarios. It's all there, over 500 questions in the app, and anybody studying for an exam or anybody who just wishes to brush up a little bit on their collision regulations, check out the link which we'll put down in the description of the podcast for you to be able to follow and subscribe to the app and go ahead and enhance your understanding of the collision regulations. Going forward, we're going to be launching a lot more apps on subjects such as legislative requirements and MARPOL, so do keep an eye out for when those apps do drop. Anyway, let's get back to the podcast in hand, and the podcast I would like to talk to you today about is going to be all about narrow channels. I've recently done some studies on narrow channels, and narrow channels themselves are pretty hazardous areas, as I'm sure a lot of you will already know. If you've navigated a ship within a narrow channel, you'll know that there are quite a lot of extra risks that we take whilst navigating in a narrow channel, and the management of the navigation of a ship within a narrow channel is very important. Narrow channels are often seen as areas where the risk is so high that taking a pilot to navigate through the narrow channel is normally not just a good idea but a legal requirement. And narrow channels themselves, we go along them so often in our careers, but have we ever stopped to think what makes a narrow channel, where those risks come from, what at the end of the day do the collision regulations tell us about narrow channels, and what advice can I give you for navigating a ship within a narrow channel from my 25 years experience as a Southampton pilot? Really important, first of all, to address the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that currently we do not have a definitive definition of a narrow channel. Rule 9 does not define what a narrow channel is. It simply talks about the requirements of what must be done in narrow channels and fairways. So we currently do not have either a legal or, for that matter, practical definition of a narrow channel given in any kind of official publication. So really, in order to define what narrow channels are, we need to go back to the courts. And when we go back to the courts, it's not a case of picking out a single case that describes what a narrow channel is or that came to the conclusion as to how to define a narrow channel. We basically have to bring them all together. Now, a lot of the initial cases from narrow channels are back from the early to mid 1960s, where pretty much pre the use of radar, where collisions in narrow channels were happening quite frequently, where speed was an issue, ships were getting bigger, and the interaction in narrow channels perhaps wasn't understood fully. More recently, the Ever Smart and the Alexandra one. The UK Supreme Court discussed what a narrow channel was considered to be, but that was against whether or not a crossing rule should apply within a narrow channel. The Saga Explorer in the Admiralty Court is another recent example where squat and bank effect in a channel caused an incident, and the Admiralty Court heard about what was done to minimise the hydrodynamic realities of restricted fairways, and how those hydrodynamic realities were consistent with what Rule 9 required us to do. So there are some recent court cases, but as I say, a lot of the court cases which discuss what narrow channels actually are go back sort of most of them pre-radar really, but certainly go back to the days where we were perhaps still learning about those hydrodynamic effects. Now, the IMO have not defined a narrow channel, right? And those of you who are familiar with the collision regulations will know that Rule 9 does not define a narrow channel. Rule 9 is titled narrow channels, but at the end of the day, nothing in there describes it. The words narrow channel or fairway come up repeatedly throughout the throughout Rule 9 without actually defining that narrow channel or fairway. Now, if we take a lot of this case law and we pull little bits from the judgments from this case law together to create some form of description, then a narrow channel or a fairway is where the navigable width is insufficient for vessels to manoeuvre freely, requiring them to follow a defined track. Now, the defined track keeps coming up again and again and again. Yeah, whether it's a dredged defined track, a defined track marked with buoys, a defined track put in for traffic management purposes. Nonetheless, the defined track seems to be where we keep sort of coming across it when talking about narrow channels. Although there's no fixed dimensional definition of this, so, you know, what navigable width are we talking about here in order to define the defined track? Although there's no actual numbers put on it, the characteristics of a narrow channel or fairway are pretty consistent. Courts themselves in the past have considered the available navigational width of the narrow channel, obviously, depth constraints within the narrow channel, traffic patterns within the channel, the necessity to stay within a dredged area within a narrow channel, whether ships meeting or overtaking in narrow channels impose undue risks, whether the physical bank constraints of a narrow channel mean that the route that is followed must be followed very, very carefully. The ability for a vessel to turn within a channel is another thing that the courts consider. In other words, if you were proceeding up a narrow channel and you wanted to go back out, or for some reason you couldn't proceed any further, are you able to physically turn the ship around and take it back out of the channel? If those risks that I've just mentioned or those dimensions are imposed, then we can consider ourselves to be within a narrow channel. Basically, if we combine it, let's use this as close to an official description as we can make up. And we have made it up because nobody's actually decided upon it in a court. A narrow channel or fairway is a waterway where the navigable width is insufficient for vessels to manoeuvre freely, requiring them to follow a defined track. That's what we're going to stick to for the time being with our description of what a narrow channel is. Narrow channels do come with some typical characteristics that a mariner would understand when navigating in a narrow channel. First of all, you've got your hydrodynamic effects. Yep. Now, a lot of these hydrodynamic effects are managed by managing the speed properly. But hydrodynamic effects such as bank suction, bank rejection, squat, these are all effects that vessels will feel in even in relatively open water. But when navigating in narrow channels, those effects are multiplied or enhanced because the water movement that creates the effects is exaggerated by the fact that it is confined within a much smaller area. Another characteristic used by mariners are that deep draft ships require to follow the centre line of the channel. So Rule 9 requires us to navigate as close to the starboard side of the channel as is safe and practicable. Well, if you're very, very deep draft, you're going to want to stay in the centre line of the channel. Maybe that's where the deeper water is. Maybe that's where you get the less hydrodynamic effects. But nonetheless, the ability to push right over to the starboard side to allow safe passing may not be there, particularly with deep draft vessels. Another characteristic of another channel is that the limited width means that it's fairly unsafe to meet other vessels there. Now, being deep draft or not deep draft, even if you have two vessels meeting that are navigating as close to the starboard side of the channel as is safe and practicable to allow them to pass, is this passing safe? Even with the speed under control, is it safe to pass two vessels within a narrow channel? Restricted underkill clearances. Most narrow channels are dredged these days, and the dredging is dredged to a specific depth in order to allow ships of a specific size to use the specific channel. The chart note will say maintain depth or dredged area, and it's maintained to a certain level to allow ships to come in, occasionally with minimum underkill clearance, which means that not only do we have exacerbated hydrodynamic effects, again, it means that the sheer design of the channel requires ships to maintain the centre line. Pilotage. If you've got a pilotage district through a channel, chances are that that is considered by both the government of the country that has approved the pilotage laws that apply locally, and the actual port authority, or as we call it in the UK, the competent harbour authority itself, considers the channel to be narrow, or so narrow that extra expertise and extra bridge manning is required to safely navigate along it, in the form of taking on board a pilot. So that in itself can define a narrow channel. Also, mariners would normally assume that a channel is a narrow channel if it is regulated or controlled by a VTS. So VTSs are, of course, at the end of the day, only called a VTS if they are able to give specific instructions to ships. So IMO Resolution A1158, which came out or came into force in 2021, basically says that any vessel traffic service that is able to give a direction to a ship should be called and known as a VTS. If there's no legal ability to give that direction, then they cannot be called a VTS. Now, if you have a VTS in place and that VTS is able to give instructions to ships to allow either one-way traffic along a channel or to only allow ships of a certain size to pass within that channel, then once again we can consider that to be a narrow channel or fairway. Now, in Southampton, we have several channels where we restrict the passing of vessels within the channel. Anybody that's been in and out of Southampton will know the notorious Thorn Channel, which is just to the north of Cowes and part of the deep water route into the port of Southampton. We have very, very strict laws on what can and cannot pass in that channel. Ultimately, any ship over 220 metres long must have what we call clear channel status. They can't meet another ship of any size within that channel. Ships over 180 metres can't pass each other within the channel. So if we come down, if you like, a step from that, if the ship is 180 metres, it can't meet another ship over 180 metres coming in the same direction. Doesn't mean that it's a clear channel vessel. It just means that we can't pass ships that are any larger than that together. So two 179 metre ships, for instance, can meet within the Thorn Channel. We also have special rules that apply to smaller vessels within the Thorn Channel to help emphasise the impeding requirement of Rule 9. We say that sailing vessels and vessels under 20 metres should not pass within 1,000 metres ahead or 100 metres either side of a ship navigating in the Thorn Channel. Now, when you've got laws like that in place, and laws that are enforced by Southampton VTS as a true vessel traffic service, in other words, one with the authority to give directions, then you can pretty much say that that is a narrow channel or fairway. Let's now drop back a little bit onto my experience. So I believe that some channels are quite obviously narrow channels. They're obviously narrow channels because you can see that there is restricted width and restricted depth to the channel. Thorn Channel in Southampton is notorious, but there are other channels in Southampton which have those same characteristics. The North Channel, a 2-cable wide channel with a depth that self-maintains. We don't maintain or advertise it, but self-maintains a little over 4 metres, is a narrow channel. Now, because ships with drafts greater than about 7 metres can't use that channel even at high water, that does mean that the ships going up and down it are fairly small. So it's almost self-regulating, and that's indicative of a narrow channel. It may not be specifically controlled by a VTS, but self-regulates itself because the sheer size and depth of the channel means that you can't have big vessels trying to pass because it's not deep enough to allow those vessels in. So, again, my experience says to me that the North Channel is a narrow channel, self-regulating, but at the same time, we need to moderate our speed because our underkill clearance in there can be reduced. We also need to ensure that if we're meeting other vessels, that we do so at a state of tide that allows us to use the somewhat shallower edges of that channel to allow the pass to happen safely. Speed is really important in the North Channel in Southampton. If you try and do it too quickly, not only do you squat, but your ability to maintain your course within that channel starts to become a little bit tricky as the squat effects take hold. Cavitation around the propeller makes the propeller and the rudder less efficient, and ships do veer off. And she's only 2 cables wide, so particularly if you're navigating close to the starboard side of the channel to pass another ship, even before that ship arrives, if you're going fast and you lose a bit of directional stability, quickly find yourself very, very close to the shallows on either side of that channel. We also have the deep water route out by the Nab Tower, which I think anybody would define as a narrow channel. Ships that use that deep water route are big, very big, 400 metres long, 62 metres wide. The biggest container ships in the world put themselves inside that channel with underkill clearances as little as 2.5 metres. So that's quite obviously, to me, a narrow channel, because you've got one-way traffic in it. When you've got a big ship in there, a big ship that needs the deep water route can't meet another big ship coming out that needs a deep water route. Now, this is obviously controlled by VTS, and the traffic movements are planned to avoid conflicts within that deep water route. But that, to me, is quite obviously a narrow channel. It's designed to house the biggest ships in the world with a minimum under-keel clearance. But sometimes it's not just about how far away the limits of those channels are to port and to starboard. Sometimes it's about what constitutes the limits of that channel. A great example of this, again on the approach to Southampton, is where the channel, the main channel, passes through two Napoleonic forts. So these forts are huge steel and concrete structures that were initially constructed to defend the Solent, and in particular the port of Portsmouth, against French invasion in Napoleonic times. Now, although the distance between these two forts would appear to be sufficient for ships to pass each other in there, and when I say sufficient for ships to pass, you can get two very large vessels to pass in between these forts without there being too much problem between them. The forts are, exactly 1 mile apart, 1 nautical mile apart. Now that may have been something that was decided when they were built, that they're going to be 1 nautical mile apart. If you measure the distance in between the two forts, 1 nautical mile, 1852, and that's pretty much the distance between these two forts. Now, although that's 1 mile and you can fit 2 big ships through, you are confined within there. If you add small vessels, if you add crossing vessels, fishing vessels in amongst those forts, and you had to push over to one side of that channel, you're going to be navigating a very large ship very close to a structure that is of considerable size and considerable strength. In other words, contact with either of those forts and the ship is more likely to come off second best. So it's not the fact that the channel isn't wide, the channel is 1 mile wide. It's the fact that you are navigating past some extreme hazards. And that, to me as well, means that that is a narrow channel. So there are so many different things to take into account. Navigating within or along a defined route is what we said earlier on, was pretty much what comes out of all of the case studies on narrow channels. Now, that defined route may be defined for lots of different reasons other than the fact that the channel is dredged or buoyed. And a good example of this is the area of the inner pilot boarding station in Southampton, known as the North Sturbridge. Now, this is an even wider stretch of water, but within that stretch of water, you have ships taking pilots, you have high-speed ferries crossing, you have car ferries crossing, and you have big ships in transit. Because the activities of the other vessels tend to happen on the extremities of the channel, this forces big vessels to follow a defined route through the area. And if they would have to alter course for another vessel, or alter course to maintain a course and speed over the ground, or any reason why they had to make a significant alteration of course, very, very quickly they're going to find themselves encroaching upon either the Sturbridge bank to the south or the coastline to the north. Now, again, this is a very wide open expanse of water, but the ships coming to and from the port of Southampton have to follow that defined route to stay clear of other operational areas, and therefore we can consider that to be a narrow channel. So I've tried to define it for you by giving you so many examples of the risks associated with it, and of course, how we try to define it in the first place. The risks of narrow channels are recognised internationally, though. So even though we don't have this official definition from the IMO, the fact that Rule 9 exists means that we recognise that narrow channels are very, very high-risk areas. I'm not going to go through Rule 9 in totality, but let's just put into plain English some of the requirements of Rule 9. We've already mentioned the requirement to navigate as close to the side of the channel that lies on a ship's starboard side as is safe and practicable. In other words, you're staying as close as is safe and practicable to the starboard side when proceeding along that narrow channel or fairway. The words outer limit are used. So, they're saying get over as far as it's safe and practicable for you too. The rule says that vessels in 20 metres of sailing vessels must not impede the passage of a vessel that can safely navigate only within a narrow channel or fairway. Let's look at that. That's really important, because safely navigating only within a narrow channel or fairway may not relate directly to draft. It may relate directly, such as the area around the North Sturbridge, to activities that are happening on the extremities of that channel that a big vessel needs to stay away from and stick to the defined route. So if we were to navigate outside the narrow channel, we might meet anchored ships, we may meet small vessels, fishing vessels. There may be other reasons why we can safely navigate only within the narrow channel, other than draft itself. And that's really important point to take on board regarding narrow channels. Fishing vessels shouldn't impede the passage of any vessel in a narrow channel. Fishing vessels are obviously very restricted in their ability to take any kind of action due to the fact they've got nets behind them or trolling lines out. So if they start to put themselves in narrow channels, that does generate a very, very high risk situation. Rule 9 even says that any vessel shouldn't cross if the crossing is going to impede a vessel that can safely navigate only within it. So it goes as far as to say you shouldn't cross a narrow channel if you think the ship navigating in it is confined to that narrow channel. Yeah. Again, it's about navigating safely in the channel, which will include draft, but isn't solely a draft-related requirement. Overtaking in narrow channels is recognised as being a risk because there may not be sufficient space to overtake it, and overtaking by its sheer nature requires a ship to increase its speed. So we have signals that can be sounded in narrow channels to ask for more water to allow overtaking to specifically happen. I hate overtaking in narrow channels, I must admit, unless I am pushed for time with regards to tide or something like that. Overtaking in a narrow channel always feels wrong. It feels restricted. It feels like it takes an eternity to get past the ship that you're overtaking in the narrow channel. And really, overtaking in narrow channels is a horrible manoeuvre to have to do, and one that we should only attempt if, one, we're happy that the time it takes for the manoeuvre to happen is conducive to the narrow channel itself. In other words, can we safely get past the ship ahead of us before we approach, for instance, the next turn that we're going to have to make within the narrow channel? So overtaking, not good. Narrow channels themselves, the view in a narrow channel can be obstructed by lots of different things. Intervening obstructions, land, buildings, anchored vessels, all sorts of things may mean that you can't see vessels coming in the other direction. Again, Rule 9 recognises this as a risk and says that we've got to sound a signal as we're approaching that, which is basically one prolonged. Yeah. Rule 9 even acknowledges that anchoring in narrow channels can be a risk that we don't want. Now, obviously, if you've got an emergency, you're going to have to drop the hook in a narrow channel, and we have had that in Southampton where ships have lost engines where they've had to drop their anchor in a narrow channel. But the moment they do, VTS will obviously take the mantle and start to advise ships of the fact that the anchored vessel is there, and will, if the narrow channel is narrow enough, probably close the channel in response to the anchored vessel. So Rule 9 recognises that navigation in a narrow channel requires careful management, careful consideration. The management of navigation in a narrow channel obviously will come from two areas. It may come from a VTS service, but is more likely to come from the bridge team themselves. Now, as I said earlier on, the latest IMO resolution on VTS, Alpha 1158, defines a VTS as a radio service that is able and has the legal ability to give directions to ships. If a ship does not have that legal ability, it cannot call itself a VTS now. It must call itself either a traffic organisation service or a navigational assistance service. Without the ability to give directions, it cannot call itself a VTS. If you've got a narrow channel that needs managing, then the radio service managing that narrow channel must be able to give instructions to ships. And therefore, narrow channels are generally controlled by a VTS. And in the case of all the narrow channels that I've discussed in the Solent area, they are all controlled by Southampton VTS, a true VTS service with the legal ability to give a direction to a ship. Management of this, very, very important. Obviously, it will enhance safe navigation management by VTS. It reduces the environmental risk. It prevents congestion within the channel by ensuring that ships are properly separated. Obviously, supports the safe passage of deep draft ships. Can advise on where a deep draft ship is in relation to the defined route within the channel. Now, Southampton have a line on their radars within VTS. So anybody, we call it the radar reference line, it's not on the charts, but anybody in the Thorn channel, for instance, can ask VTS where they are in relation to the radar reference line, which is particularly important, of course, when you're navigating in restricted visibility in these channels and are relying on parallel indexes, radar returns, and your ECDIS to ensure that the vessel is centre. VTS can give you support by telling you where you are, at least in Southampton, with reference to this radar reference line. A VTS will also enhance the situation awareness of vessels that are using narrow channels by telling those vessels about the approach of other vessels, the timing of other vessels, reminding sometimes that a vessel needs to be a specific place at a specific time in order to meet that other vessel at a wider part of the channel. We call them in Southampton a Forley Pass because the channel off of the oil terminal, off of Forley, is wider than the narrow channel that we have in the Thorn or the narrow channel that we go up Southampton Water, both of which would fall into that definition of a defined route. So VTS contribute massively to the safe management of a narrow channel. But the primary management of a ship in a narrow channel must come from the bridge team themselves. This means that the ship will only enter the narrow channel if the bridge team consider it safe to do so. A lot of ships will use an abort point to make that decision. So they'll be approaching the narrow channel. They'll have an abort point marked on their electronic chart where they will not commit past that abort point unless they are happy to commit to that narrow channel. Speed will need to be managed carefully on board the ship. We've already discussed when we're talking about the North Channel in Southampton that if speed is high, we can quickly lose directional stability of the ship through the hydrodynamic effects, through squat, bank rejection, bank attraction, and the vessel can quite easily touch bottom on the extremes of the channel if it goes too fast. If you're going too fast and you meet another vessel within the channel, the hydrodynamic effects between the two vessels can either force the vessels apart as the positive pressures of the bow meet, and that may cause the vessel to come too close to the extremity of the narrow channel, or as the vessels pass, they can be attracted towards one another, particularly if the speed is high, and this will cause a collision between the two vessels. So speed management is important. Draft management is important. We need to know the draft of the vessel, not just in salt water, but the draft of the vessel in the density of water that we are navigating in. This means that if the vessel does sink and increase its draft in response to the seawater being less dense, being brackish or even fresh, we need to take that reduced underkill clearance into account. Means of navigation in the narrow channel need to be managed carefully by the bridge team. What are we relying on to ensure we are in safe water within that narrow channel? Do we have a visual mean, such as a transit? For instance, the North Channel in Southampton does have a transit. It's not a deliberate transit, but two small black chimneys in the oil refinery line up to mark the centre of the North Channel quite nicely. If we've got that, that's a definitive monitoring of our progress along that narrow channel. There may be specific leads put up, such as in the approaches to Portsmouth, where the aircraft carrier leads have been put up in order to give the large aircraft carriers using the Portsmouth narrow channels a definitive indication of where they are within that channel. Parallel indexing is a great way of ensuring that you stay within the navigable water of a narrow channel. And most of the narrow channels, no, all of the narrow channels in the Solent that I navigate through, we have established PIs, which even with the introduction of both electronic charts and our portable pilot units, I will still put a PI on the radar. It takes seconds to do, and it's just to double check that you are where you think you are within that channel. Regularly fixing the vessel's position. If we don't have an electronic chart and we are on a paper chart, we're going to have to regularly fix the vessel's position on that paper chart, not just to see where we are, but to work out where we're going. And monitoring our ECDIS, monitoring our pilot PPU, and ensuring that the position fixing systems that we use to monitor our position within those electronic devices are operating to maximum efficiency is essential. I was on a large container ship the other night, and we set up our portable pilot units, our PPUs, to find out that we didn't have SBAS. SBAS is the satellite-based augmentation system that self-corrects your position and makes it a lot more accurate. Now, the SBAS feature was playing up, so we just had regular GPS, not even DGPS, which, as most of you will know, has now been switched off in the port of Southampton. So we were, at one point, navigating on just regular GPS with regular GPS accuracies, which can be as poor as 100 metres. So whilst we were using that, we had to be very, very careful that we were happy with our position in that narrow channel and not over relying on the GPS position on our portable pilot unit. Now, a couple of updates later, and we got the SBAS working, and so we had that augmented system in place, and the self-correcting satellites were working well. Again, that was reassuring, but that's something that we monitor when relying on electronic charts to verify our position within the narrow channel. The other thing, of course, bridge manning in a narrow channel. You need extra manning on a narrow channel, yeah? The ship is probably going to need to be in hand steering in a narrow channel. Autopilots, although some of them can be okay, can be ineffective in narrow channels. They may not be able to turn the ship quick enough. They may not be able to keep an accurate enough course in a narrow channel. So a helmsman is normally a must in a narrow channel. Extra lookouts are required in narrow channels because there are a lot more traffic around the narrow channel. We've already talked about traffic densities increasing in the vicinity of narrow channels through other vessels, through small vessels. So we need extra lookouts. We need experience on the bridge in a narrow channel. That experience can come from taking a pilot, but reasonably we'd expect a senior deck officer to be up there on the bridge, most likely the captain, to support the officer of the watch and ensure that the officer watch is free to carefully monitor the progress of that vessel along a narrow channel to ensure that it stays in safe water. So an overview or management of the navigation by a more senior officer would be reasonable to expect in a narrow channel, and so manning should also be up. I hope that this podcast into narrow channels has given you a bit of an insight into the definitions, the risks, the measures that are taken within narrow channels. My personal experience of what makes a narrow channel has all been helpful and interesting to you. Next time you're in a narrow channel, or what you perceive to be a narrow channel, think about the measures that you've got in place and just ensure that you have recognised the risk of that channel, regardless of how often you have navigated through it. Those of you that are on ferries in particular, you're navigating in narrow channels all the time. Narrow channels are your bread and butter, but take time to recognise the risk of that narrow channel. As a pilot, I navigate narrow channels for a living, and every now and again I have to remind myself of the risks around me and adjust my navigation accordingly. Thanks everyone for listening to this podcast, and I look forward to welcoming you back to the next one. But in the meantime, do look at the description of this podcast, check out the links to our new quiz app, and I'm pretty sure you'll find that is very, very useful. And of course, the COLREGs quiz app does talk about narrow channels. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a great day.